The cell smelled like hot metal and old fear, and Mara had stopped noticing either a long time ago. She sat cross-legged, on the floor near the far corner, her and Pip's, with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling's single vent. The vent was 12 centimeters across. She had measured it with her thumb. It breathed recycled air that tasted faintly of sulfur, and something sweet she'd never been able to identify. And once every rotation of the depot's artificial day cycle, if she pressed her face to the mesh and angled just right, she could see a strip of sky the color of a bruise healing toward yellow. Pip called it the big wide blue, even though it wasn't blue, had never been blue on this world. Kids name things for what they want them to be. Mara had decided, years ago, that this was not a flaw. "Show me again," Pip said. She was 9, or close enough to it. Mara had lost 2 months somewhere in the second year and had never been sure where. They'd gone. Pip sat with her knees tucked up, her back to the opposite wall, watching her mother with the particular quality of attention that only children have. Total, unhurried, as if nothing could possibly be more important than this. Mara held up her left forearm. Under the skin of her inner wrist, barely visible unless you angled it toward the light panel, was a faint raised seam. The intake barcode ran the length of it. A subdermal strip the Veth had printed into her on the day they'd arrived, along with the retinal tag they'd burned into her left eye. She didn't remember much about intake. She remembered the sound of the marking instrument. She remembered Pip crying. She remembered keeping her own face very still, so Pip would have something still to look at. "What does it say?" Pip asked. She asked every few days. The answer never changed, but the question was a kind of ceremony. "It says I belong to Depot 7. Mara lowered her arm. "But it's wrong." Pip almost smiled, not quite. She was a serious child, had been even before all this. And seriousness had calcified in here into something harder. A kind of watchfulness. Mara loved her for it, and grieved it simultaneously, which was the exact texture of everything these days. The depot was a processing facility. That was the polite Veth word for it. On the surface, it received and cataloged and held humans collected from the outer settlements. Runaways, survivors of collapsed colony ships, people who'd been in the wrong place when the perimeter moved. What it did beneath the surface, in the sub-level corridors, was something the Veth bureaucracy did not put in its own literature. Mara had pieced it together over 3 years, from overheard conversations, between guards, and from the marks on other prisoners' arms when they came back from the processing rooms. And from what the legate did to her. She called him the legate. The other prisoners had different names for him. Some couldn't name him at all. He was large, not grotesquely so, not the movie monster large of old Earth holos, but the specific, functional largeness of something built to dominate enclosed spaces. His exoskeletal armor was matte black and grew directly from his chitin. The boundary between equipment and body was impossible to locate. He moved without sound. The first time Mara had heard him outside the cell door, she'd thought the sound was the building settling. A low harmonic vibration, almost subsonic, that she'd since learned was how Veth officers broadcast their rank. A frequency that pressed on the inner ear like a thumb. He came every 4 days. Mara knew this because she'd counted from the first week. The marks she'd scratched into the paint behind the sleeping pallet, fine lines that Pip had eventually started helping her make. They had a system. 4 days between visits. 20 minutes per visit. He fed on the bioelectrical field that humans generated. The Veth called it something that didn't translate, but Mara thought of it as the static of being alive. The low hum of a body doing its work of living. The extraction apparatus attached to her neck and drew off the surplus. It wasn't lethal. It was specifically calibrated not to be lethal, the way a good farmer calibrates for a long yield. He took no particular interest in Pip. This was both the most important thing Mara knew, and the fact she thought about least. Thinking about it directly felt like pressing on a bruise she couldn't afford to acknowledge. On this particular morning, if it was morning, the light panel had brightened, so she called it morning. She was counting something else. She'd been counting something else for 6 months. The legate had a routine. It was so fixed, so impeccably consistent, that Mara had initially assumed it was programmed. The same approach sequence, the same positioning, the same duration, the same angle of the extraction port, Veth efficiency, Veth precision. She'd resented it for 2 years before she understood what it meant. It meant he was not afraid of her. That was the thing about being livestock. You became invisible in a particular way. The legate processed her the way she might process a meal, with attention to the mechanics, with no thought at all to the thing being processed. He had never once looked at her eyes during a session. He looked at the equipment readings. He calibrated, he extracted, he left. 20 minutes, 4 days, 3 years. He had forgotten if he'd ever known that she was watching him too. He wore his armor except for a section along the left lateral thorax. A panel that articulated open during extraction to allow the equipment to interface with his own processing membrane. She'd noticed it in month 2. She'd spent month 3 working out the geometry of it from memory. How wide the opening was, how far his arm extended, what was accessible at that angle. She'd spent months 4 through 18 imagining, and then discarding, everything she could not actually do. In month 19, she'd found the piece of metal. It was a sheared-off fastener from the sleeping pallet, no longer than her middle finger, with one end that had work-hardened into something close to an edge from years of the pallet scraping on the floor. She'd kept it in her shoe. She'd spent a year deciding whether to use it. The thing that had finally decided her was not rage. It wasn't desperation, though she felt both. It was arithmetic. Pip had turned what she thought was 9, which meant she'd been 8 when they came, meant she remembered almost nothing of before. Meant that this, the cell, the scratched marks, big wide blue through the vent, was not Pip's memory of captivity, it was her memory of life. That was the calculation that changed things. Mom. Tell me about the ship. This was also a ceremony. Mara let her eyes close. Let herself recall the texture of it. Not just the facts, but the feel of things. The ship was called the Ardent Cross. She was a mid-range colony tender, which means she was built ugly and flew ugly, and smelled like recycled air and somebody's cooking all the time, because there were always people cooking something. Your dad was on kitchen rotation the week we met. He was making something with reconstituted chickpeas, and it smelled terrible. But you liked him anyway. I liked him despite the chickpeas. Is a higher bar. Pip did smile this time, just a flash of it pressed quickly flat. Mara stored the image. He would have been able to get us out, Pip said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite a statement. It was the way children posit the world they want, not as lies they believe, but as propositions they're testing. Mara chose her words with care. He would have tried. She paused. We're going to try too. Pip looked at her. The watchfulness intensified into something else, the specific, held breath stillness of a child who has been hoping for something and is suddenly afraid to hope harder. When? Pip said. Not a question either. Next visit. The silence after this was complete. Then Pip nodded once, with a gravity that made her look older than she was, and younger at the same time. Mara reached into her shoe. The 4 days passed the way time passes, when you are very afraid of it, very slowly, and partly in chunks that vanish without accounting for themselves. Mara ate the rations when they came through the slot. She did the exercises she'd maintained for 3 years, the ones she'd read once in a survival manual, and memorized and adapted for a 12-meter, square room. She watched the vent for the strip of sky. She and Pip played the game they called cartography, where they took turns adding a detail to a map of a made-up place. And the rule was, you couldn't add a feature that made the map smaller. The night before the 4th day, Mara didn't sleep. She lay on the pallet and stared at the ceiling and went through it again. Slowly, the way you run your tongue over a loose tooth to check if it has moved. The geometry of it. The angle of the armor panel. Cheat. The distance from where she'd be positioned to the left lateral thorax. She thought about what happened if she missed. She thought about it for a long time. Not because she wanted to, but because she had learned, over 3 years, that the things you refuse to look at directly are the things that reach up and take you sideways. Better to look. Better to hold the worst-case scenario fully in your hands and know its weight and know what you would do inside it. The worst case was not good. She knew that. She held it, she set it down. Then she thought about the strip of sky. About what Pip's face might look like seeing it for real, underneath, with room to turn around in. And she put the other thought down. She thought about the ship, the Ardent Cross, the way it smelled on a good day, which was people and food and the particular organic warmth of a space too small for the number of lives crammed into it. She thought about mornings where she had woken up with nothing urgent to do and made herself a cup of coffee and listened to the ships, engines, and thought about nothing in particular. She hadn't known, during those mornings, that she was having them. She'd spent them on ordinary thoughts. What to eat, what the maintenance schedule was, whether she'd replied to someone's message. She hadn't thought, this is a morning where nothing is wrong, hold this. She was going to give Pip those mornings. She had decided. The sound, when it came, was the low harmonic she'd spent 3 years learning to brace for. Mara stood up from the pallet and moved to the marked spot on the floor. She had not marked it physically, but it was as real as a painted X, established through repetition, and she breathed. Slow, even. The kind of breathing you do when you are trying not to look like you are breathing. Carefully, Pip was in the corner. Her face was turned to the wall. This was agreed. Mara had been specific. Don't watch, don't move, don't make any sound that's different from the sounds you normally make. Pretend it's any other visit. Let him think it's any other visit. The door opened. The legate was exactly as he always was. The size of him, the sub-bass harmonic of authority rolling off his armor, the absolute economy of his movement. He crossed to Mara without looking at her face. He never looked at her face. He gestured once. The short lateral movement that meant hold still, and reached for the equipment interface on his belt. Mara held still, positioned himself, left lateral thorax to her right side the way it always was. His dominant side, his processing side, the mechanical habit of 3 years of identical sessions. The armor panel began its articulation. She heard the soft click of the sections separating and felt the familiar low-frequency precursor signal that meant the extraction array was initializing. She had 20 seconds before interface. She did not think. Her left hand came up to his arm. The gesture she'd calculated looked compliant, the kind of brace position adjustment he'd seen from her 100 times. Her right hand, the one with the fastener, came up from behind her thigh. He had 4 seconds to react. Maybe 2 before he understood what was happening. She hit the membrane interface point with everything she had. The legate made a sound she had never heard a Veth make. Not a vocalization. Something deeper. Something that seemed to come from inside the armor itself. A resonant fracturing of the sub-bass tone. He staggered. Actually staggered. 1 step, which was the most profoundly alien thing she'd ever seen him do, because he had never moved at anything but purpose before. His arm came up. Not toward her, but inward, the automatic movement of a creature protecting its damaged side. Mara stepped back. She was shaking. She had not expected to be shaking. The legate turned to face her. Slowly. And for the first time in 3 years, he looked at her eyes. What she felt in that moment she never had adequate language for afterward. Not triumph. Something stranger. The specific quality of being seen by something that had not understood, until this exact instant, that you were something that could be dangerous. The recategorization happening in real time behind those compound eyes. She watched him revise her and found, beneath the fear and the shaking and the adrenaline, flooding every available system in her body, something that felt almost like dark satisfaction. She had been waiting a long time to be revised. The extraction array was still partially deployed. The membrane interface, now exposed and damaged, was cycling through error states. She could hear it from the sound profile of his armor, a stuttering irregularity in the harmonic that had never been there before. He reached for his belt. Mara moved. She didn't go for him. She went for the door, which he had not sealed, because he had never sealed it, because it had never been necessary. She hit the release panel with her palm, in the same motion she'd rehearsed mentally hundreds of times, using the Kenko she'd seen him enter through the reflection in the light panel in month 8. The door opened. She was at the corner. Pip, now. Pip was already moving. She has been still as stone. She coiled, and she crossed the room in the time it took the legate to turn, and Mara grabbed her hand, and they were through the door and into the corridor and running. The corridor was white-lit, and smelled of the same sulfur and sweet as the vent, except more concentrated, and it branched left and right. Mara went left. She had chosen left months ago based on the sound profile of the depot during the legate's arrival. The harmonic always approached, from the right, which meant left, was further from the primary guard station. Behind them, the sound from the cell changed. The stuttering in the legate's armor resolved back into the sub-bass authority tone, but lower now, and with an edge she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something colder. The beginning of a hunt. They ran. The corridor was long. Mara had no map of what was beyond the cell block, had never had a map. What she had was a principle she'd worked out over 3 years of listening to the depot's sounds from inside the cell. Sound travels, structure shapes it. And if you pay attention long enough, you can build a rough architecture from audio alone. She'd heard the ventilation system cycling. She'd heard supply deliveries. She'd heard, twice in 3 years, sounds that might have been other human voices from somewhere south and below. South and below was where she was going. Pip ran without asking questions. Later, Mara would think that this was the most extraordinary thing about her daughter. Quality of her trust was not blind. Pip was watchful, precise, serious. She had seen 3 years of captivity and processed every day of it and kept her own counsel about most of it. And she trusted her mother anyway, with full information. That's not faith, Mara thought. That's something rarer. First intersection. She went straight. The smell changed, less sulfur, more of something biological. That was right. Processing areas would have a different atmospheric signature. Second intersection. Left. The light panels here were slightly dimmer, and the floor had a textured strip along one edge that she'd have bet money was a safety marking. Safety markings meant areas where Veth moved equipment. Equipment meant a different kind of door. She could hear the legate behind them. Footsteps. Veth moved too quietly for footsteps. The harmonic, she'd been living in earshot of it for 3 years, and she could read it the way. You learn to read weather, its volume, its frequency, its texture. He was moving fast, he was also. She listened hard, alone. He had not yet triggered a full depot alert. She thought she knew why. In month 11, she'd overheard 2 guards in a low-register Veth exchange just outside the cell door. She'd had to reconstruct meaning from context. She understood maybe 40% of standard Veth, and rather less of the dialect spoken at the depot. But the tone of the exchange was unmistakable. It was embarrassed. One of them was describing something to the other, and the other was not laughing. Veth didn't have laughter. The subsonic response was the equivalent of it. The way you laugh at someone who has made a small, preventable mistake. The legate was an officer. He had a status. The humans in his care were livestock, which meant that if one of them had damaged him and escaped, there was a kind of shame in that. Not the kind that prevented him from acting, the kind that made him want to resolve it quietly, quickly, without the depot's administrative apparatus becoming aware of it. That was a window, narrow. But windows were what they had. The other thing she was counting was more abstract, harder to quantify. And she had spent a long time trying to decide if it was real or if she was building something out of desperation because she needed something to build. The legate flinched, not always, not often enough to establish a pattern in the first year, which was why she'd discarded the observation initially. But in the second year, she'd started watching for it specifically. And in the third year, she'd cataloged 17 instances. A slight lateral shift in the armor panels along his back when Pip cried. An imperceptible adjustment of his position when the extraction was running longer than usual. A quality of stillness in him when she spoke that was different from the stillness of something simply not listening. The Veth, as she understood them, which was imperfectly, cobbled from overheard information and 2 years of a crash course in alien behavior conducted entirely from 12 square meters, were a species that processed the world through a sensory apparatus quite different from humans. The bioelectrical extraction wasn't merely nutritional. It was, she suspected, informational too. The legate fed on the static of her being alive, and that static carried everything. Cortisol patterns, cardiac rhythm changes, the neurological signature of attention and fear and calculation. He was reading her every session, whether he knew it or not, which meant he knew she was afraid, which meant he also had to know, if the feed was as rich as she suspected, when the fear had a shape to it, when it was fear of something specific, rather than fear of everything in general. She had spent the last 6 months being extremely careful about the shape of her fear. She had built a new kind of stillness, and worn it like a second skin. The stillness of someone who has accepted things, who is no longer calculating, who is livestock in full. She didn't know if it had worked. She wouldn't know until it either did or didn't. She knew it was the best she could do. Third intersection. Straight. The biological smell was stronger and Mara could hear something mechanical, a rhythmic compression cycle, pneumatics, storage doors, something that moved under pressure. Her mental map said supply access. Her mental map was guesswork and prayer, but so was everything else right now. Mom, Pip said, not slowing. I know.
He's closer.
I know, the harmonic was indeed closer. The legate was faster than them. Of course he was. He was built for exactly this, pursuit in enclosed spaces, and she'd known that going in. The window had never been very wide. The point was not to outrun him. The point was to reach a particular door before he closed the gap entirely. She'd been wrong about south. She realized it when the corridor opened into a wider space. A staging area, she guessed, with holding racks along the walls and the pneumatic machinery she'd heard, and one wall that was not a wall at all but a large articulated gate currently sealed. The gate smelled of outside. Sulfur and that sweet smell, different, not recycled, not processed. The actual molecules of actual air from beyond the structure. And in the staging area, 2 rows of 6 were other people. Humans, adults mostly. A few who might have been adolescents, all tagged, barcoded, standing with the particular stillness of people who've been standing like this for a while and have developed complicated relationships with hope. They looked at Mara and Pip. Mara looked back at them and made a decision that she would never afterward be completely sure about, but that in the moment felt less like a decision and more like a physical fact, like gravity. She turned around. The leg gate had just entered the staging area behind them. He stopped. She watched him process the new configuration. 12 humans, one of them the escapee he'd been pursuing, all looking at him. She watched him recalculate. She'd spent 3 years reading his body language through repetition, and she could tell when he was recalculating. The way you tell when a machine changes gears, the slight pause, the adjustment in his posture, the harmonic shifting pitch. He settled on the same posture he always used when he was establishing authority. It was an extremely familiar posture, and looking at it now from outside the cell, in different light, with other people around, Mara noticed something she'd never been quite able to see from inside it. The posture was designed to work on individuals. It was the posture of someone who had, for a very long time, dealt with people alone. I need your help, Mara said. She said it to the room. She didn't shout. There was no need to shout. The staging area was not large. She used the voice she used with Pip when she was being clear about something important. Not a request and not a command. Something in between. I need 30 seconds. I need someone to give me 30 seconds. She was thinking of the membrane interface, the damage she'd already done, the exposed panel, still partially open as far as she could tell, from the irregularity in his harmonic. One good strike from anything at all. A piece of equipment, a boot, a fist, anything, and the array would cycle down. She'd been thinking about this since the corridor. She just hadn't had the means. There was a pause in the room that felt like a long pause and was probably 2 seconds. A man near the back, heavy-shouldered, with the layered tan of someone who'd worked outside before all this, stepped forward. Then a woman next to him. Then 2 others. The legate moved and 4 people moved with him, and Mara moved with all of them, because she knew where to go, and they didn't yet. She had the fastener still in her hand, and the open membrane panel as her target, and what followed was messy, and frightened, and desperate and human in every possible connotation of the word. There was no elegant moment of it. Nobody gave a speech. People were scared and hurt, and doing things they'd never imagined doing while scared and hurt, and the legate was powerful and precise and was not accustomed to being outnumbered, or to anything being unpredictable. And those 2 facts, his precision, his unfamiliarity with chaos, were what she'd been counting on alongside everything else. The panel was as accessible for its sequencing. She had estimated 8 from watching the articulation cycle in sessions 2 and 3, and every session since she made it count. What she did in those 8 seconds was not elegant. It was not the smooth, decisive motion of someone who had trained for this. She had not trained for this. She had only thought about it, is a different thing, and produces a different result. She jammed the sheared fastener into the exposed membrane interface at a slightly wrong angle, corrected in the second, and drove it home in the third. Her hand slipped in the fourth. She redirected in the fifth. There remained 3 seconds. Produced sounds she had not anticipated, and motion from the legate that was too fast and too large, and clipped her, shoulder and sent her sideways, and Arroyo, big-shouldered former mining tech, 8 months of his own stored fury, hit the legate from behind in a way that had nothing tactical about it at all. The legate's armor cycled down, not collapsed, not destroyed, cycled down the way a machine powers off when its operating systems detect a critical error. The sub-bass harmonic simply stopped. The silence it left was the loudest thing Mara had heard in 3 years. The legate was large. He was still large without his armor's active systems. He remained large on the floor, but he was on the floor. Mara stood over him for a moment. She was breathing very hard. Her right hand hurt, in a way that meant she'd done something to it, nothing she couldn't live with, but something. She was aware of Pip at her side, and she did not look at Pip yet because she needed one more second to be certain. Her face was the face she wanted it to be. She looked up at the gate. Does anyone know how to open that? It wasn't a question either. Someone did. The world beyond the gate was larger than she'd imagined. She'd known abstractly that the depot sat in a desert. She'd built that from the sand she sometimes heard grinding in the vent. Desert is a word that collapses into nothing when you're actually standing in one. The scale of the sky alone, the actual sky, the real one, not a 12-centimeter strip of it, was something her brain initially refused to process, kept trying to reduce to something cell-shaped. She stood in the gate's shadow and looked up, and her eyes kept sliding back down, like looking directly at something too bright. Next to her, stopped. Pip was completely still. Her head was tipped back. Her face was doing something Mara had only seen it do a handful of times. Not smiling beyond smiling, something pre-linguistic. It's not blue, Pip said. No. It's, she paused. She tipped her head further back. I don't have a word for it. You'll make one, Mara said. You've got time. The sky was the color of a bruise healing toward yellow. Maybe, and she turned this thought over as they walked. 14 humans across open ground, into air that tasted of sulfur, and something sweet she still hadn't identified. Maybe it was the color of something else. Something with no Earth name because it didn't belong to Earth. It belonged to here. Her daughter looked at it like it belonged to her. They walked. The desert had a surface like compacted chalk, pale and firm, with a low wind that moved dust in long curtains at the edges of visibility. There was no obvious direction. The depot was behind them, still sealed, the alert not yet triggered, the administrative apparatus still unaware that anything had gone wrong. And ahead was 40 kilometers of surveyed terrain that she'd mapped from, guard radio traffic over 3 years, and that she was now navigating from memory and the position of a sun. She counted heads, 14, all tagged, all blinking in the too large light, like people being born into a world they'd half forgotten how to be in. His zet to shade his eyes, and stood for a moment doing nothing else, just standing with his hand up, and the enormous alien, sky above him, and the expression of someone who has been told a joke they don't understand yet, but can feel the punchline approaching. A woman was turning her own arm over, looking at the barcode seam, the way you look at something you've learned to ignore and are relearning to resent. Pair of people. She didn't know them, didn't know if they knew each other, were walking with their shoulders very nearly touching, not quite, the way people do when they're deciding. 14 people who a Veth officer had logged as stable inventory. She kept counting the gap between them and the depot, between now and the alert, east the sun's position, and wherever south-southeast fell on a world she'd only ever seen through its on-a-meter vent. She hummed. Pip looked at her sideways. She was humming something her mother had hummed to her, a tune that had no name and had probably never been written down, the kind of music that passes from person to person through proximity and repetition until it belongs to everyone and no one. She'd hummed it in the cell sometimes, very quietly when Pip was asleep. She hadn't realized she was doing it now. She didn't stop. The man from the staging area. She'd learn later, his name was Arroyo, that he'd been a mining tech from the Callaway settlement, that he'd been in the depot for 8 months. walked alongside her for a while in silence before he said anything. What south? Listening post, I think. Settlement survey beacon. I caught the carrier frequency twice through the vent. If the signal's still active, someone's listening to it. That's not a plan, Arroyo said. That's a direction. Yeah. She kept walking. The plans are what you make once you have a direction. He didn't respond for a moment. Then he fell into step properly, which was a different thing from just walking next to someone. The chalk-pale surface went on and on. The low curtains of dust moved at the edge of things. The sky continued its impossible color above them, enormous and indifferent in the way skies are when you've been inside long enough to have forgotten that indifference is not hostility. It just means the sky is large and you're in it. That's enough, that's everything. Pip found a rock. She held it up, oval, pale, with a single dark mineral inclusion running through it like a brushstroke. She turned it in her hands with the focused attention she brought to everything. Then she put it in her pocket. What for? Mara asked. Don't know yet. Pip kept walking. I'll figure it out. Yes, Mara thought. You will. Behind them, some 40 minutes into the desert walk, the depot's alert systems finally triggered. She heard the distant harmonic shift. Not the legates, something broader, a facility-level signal, and she noted it and kept walking. They had 40 minutes, possibly more, depending on how long the legate remained offline and how long the Veth bureaucracy took to organize a ground response. Bureaucracies, alien or otherwise, had momentum problems. They were built for processing, not for the specific chaos of something they'd classified as impossible happening. She'd been counting on that too. The listening post. If it was a listening post, if her two-fragment reconstruction of a carrier frequency was anywhere close to accurate, was T kilometers south-southeast. At their pace across open ground, that was 4 hours. 4 hours before the Veth response was organized. 4 hours where the math either worked or it didn't. She thought about the arithmetic that had finally decided her. Pip at 9 with no memory of before. Pip at 10, at 15, at 20 with a barcode on her arm that said she belonged to Depot 7, and no day in her living memory that didn't. She thought about the man with the chickpeas, and the ship that smelled like someone's cooking, and the particular quality of an unasked-for morning. The mornings she'd once taken entirely for granted. When you wake up with no immediate crisis and make coffee and listen to the ship breathe, and that's just a day. Just a day. She wanted to give Pip a day like that. She walked faster. After 2 hours, the dust curtains resolved into something. A structure, low to the ground, partially buried, with the kind of deliberate camouflage that suggested someone had put it there and not wanted others to know it. The carrier frequency, if she was right. If she was right, she was right. The beacon was human tech. Callaway Survey Corps, serial number corroded past reading, but the handshake protocol when Arroyo, who turned out to know what he was doing with older survey equipment, was why she'd spoken to him first. Keyed, the activation sequence was pure Earth standard. The handshake received a response. 11 seconds, she counted. 11 seconds between the signal going out and the signal coming back, and in those 11 seconds she did not breathe in any way she was aware of. The others had gone quiet behind her. Nobody offered commentary. This was the moment you either were right about or you weren't. A human response. The voice on the other end was distant and lacerated with static and the most complete sound she had heard in 3 years, because it was careless. It was a voice that didn't know it needed to be anything in particular. It was a voice that was simply its own, talking to another voice, in the entirely unself-conscious way of people who don't know anyone is listening. Survey Relay 77, confirming, wait, hang on, this is a live signal, hang on. Arroyo looked at Mara. Mara took the handset. She stood in the chalk-pale desert, with the damaged membrane fastener still in her coat pocket, and 14 people at her back, and took the handset, cleared her throat, which she hadn't expected to need to do. This is Mara Voss, formerly of the colony tender Ardent Cross. I am in the desert approximately 42 kilometers northwest of Veth Depot 7, with 13 other people. We have escaped. She paused. She heard the voice on the other end go completely still in the specific way of someone who has just received information. Their brain is catching up. 2. We have also done some damage to the depot's primary processing officer. I want to be transparent about that. He will probably recover, which is why I'd like someone to come and collect us before he does. Static. Then the voice, different now, more focused. The carelessness was still in it, but it had organized itself around the new information. How long do you need us to hold your position? She thought about the Veth bureaucracy and its momentum problems. She thought about the legate on the floor of the staging area and the damaged membrane panel and the 40-minute head start. You've got 4 hours, maybe 6. Can you do that? I can do that. The voice was making calculations she could hear. Can you do 6? She looked at the 14 people around her. Arroyo, the woman who'd stepped forward first and had said nothing since, and whose face was doing a lot of work she was keeping private. An old man in the back who was sitting down carefully and looking at the sky with an expression Mara recognized because she'd felt it herself. The recalibration of outside, the brain rediscovering that the world is large. Pip with her rock. We can do 6, Mara said. They made a camp of sorts, minimal, low to the ground, using the camouflage of the survey beacon as cover. The Veth response swept the area twice in the first 2 hours, and missed them both times, which told Mara that desert search doctrine, even Veth desert search doctrine, had the same flaw as all search doctrine. It was designed around where people were likely to go, not where they actually went. She had not gone where they were likely to go. She had gone where the signal was. Nobody plans for someone who has been listening to signals for 3 years. Pip sat next to her and didn't say much. She had the rock in her hand and was occasionally turning it, occasionally setting it down and looking at the sky. Mom, are they coming? Yes. How do you know? Mara thought about this. She thought about the voice on the handset, the carelessness of it, the way it had gone still. She thought about what it means to find out that people you thought were lost are not. She thought about how humans respond to that, reliably and without fail, across every context she had ever observed. Because we cost someone something, she said. People who cost someone something aren't forgotten. They're owed. And humans are very stubborn about what they're owed. Pip considered this. That's kind of a weird thing to be proud of. Yeah? Mara put her arm around her. We're kind of a weird thing. The sky continued to do its not-quite-blue business overhead. The wind moved dust in long curtains. Somewhere behind them, a Veth depot was generating a small administrative crisis it would be working through for weeks, because the paperwork for this kind of incident was genuinely extensive. And the legate's report would be something that passed between Veth officers in the subsonic equivalent of past notes for a long time. She'd become a story. They all had. She found that she didn't mind. When the ship came, it was smaller than she expected and louder than it needed to be, which she later learned was intentional. Survey's rescue doctrine said to announce your arrival at a distance, so no one spends adrenaline on thinking you're a threat. The pilot dropped it in a flat landing in 3 minutes and came out of the hatch before it. Fully settled. A young woman mismatched gear who ran to them with the particular combination of professional efficiency and poorly suppressed human feeling that Mara would have found funny if she weren't feeling it too. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone boarded. Pip climbed the ramp last, behind her mother, and stopped at the top to look back. She stood there for a moment, with the rock in her hand and the sky behind her. The sky that was not blue. The that she had no name for yet. Then she went inside. The hatch sealed, the ship lifted, and the desert slid away beneath them. The chalk-pale surface, the long dust curtains, the depot, with its administrative crisis in progress, and it became what all things become when you get far enough above them. Just a shape, just a mark on a larger thing, just geography. From the small viewport, Mara watched it diminish. Then she stopped watching and turned to her daughter, and they sat shoulder to shoulder in the noisy little ship, with its smell of fuel and old meals, and people, and Pip had her rock, and Mara had her hand, and neither of them needed to say anything to establish that this was a beginning. That was enough. That was, in point of fact, entirely sufficient.